Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard. You know these names. What you don't know is that they all got rich the exact same way. Flooding China with opium. Thousands of tons shipped, millions addicted, profit margins exceeding 400%. Then they spent 200 years making sure you'd never find out. Until now. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president on Mount Rushmore, the man who saved America from the Great Depression. His family fortune came from selling drugs. Hard drugs, opium. Millions of addicts, millions died, and the Roosevelts got rich, very rich. And they weren't alone. The Astors, the richest family in America during the 1800s, opium money. The Forbes family, yes, that Forbes, built their publishing empire on opium profits. The Perkins family funded Yale University with opium money. The Cabot family, Boston Brahmins, opium traders. The Russell family founded Skull and Bones at Yale University, opium smugglers. Some of the most powerful, respected, and influential families in American history built their fortunes selling drugs, not just participating, but dominating. American companies controlled 10% of the opium trade into China by the 1830s. We're talking tons of opium, hundreds of millions of dollars, and an entire generation of Chinese destroyed by addiction. American families became so rich they founded universities, museums, and political dynasties that still run the country today. This is the story no one tells. How America's elite families made their fortunes in the opium trade, how they whitewashed that history, and how the same families that got rich selling drugs then spent a century criminalizing drugs for everyone else. The hypocrisy is staggering, and the proof is undeniable. Before we go through the families, you need to understand what the opium trade actually was, not the sanitized museum version, but the reality. The opium trade was the most profitable criminal enterprise in human history. It makes the modern cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl industries look like side hustles. In the early 1800s, Western powers, Britain, America, and a few European companies, forced drugs into China at gunpoint. They didn't sell opium because the Chinese wanted it. They sold opium because it was the only thing China would buy. Let me explain. For thousands of years, China was the wealthiest civilization on Earth. They had silk, porcelain, gunpowder, tea, products the world desperately wanted. Europe was addicted to tea, but China didn't want European goods in return. They demanded silver, real money, and Europe was running out of silver fast. So Western merchants came up with a solution: drug China until they couldn't say no. They grew opium in British-controlled India, shipped it to Chinese ports, and sold it illegally. The profits were insane. You could buy opium in India for pennies and sell it in China for hundreds of times the price. Money flowed so fast that fortunes were created overnight. Ships were built, banks were founded, and family dynasties were born, all from narcotics. When the Chinese emperor tried to stop the trade, he seized and destroyed tons of opium. Britain responded by sending warships. They blew Chinese defenses to pieces and forced them to sign humiliating treaties. China had to open ports, hand over Hong Kong, pay massive reparations, and allow opium to flow freely. Millions became addicts. Entire regions collapsed. This wasn't a drug problem. It was a national catastrophe engineered for profit. And while Britain gets most of the blame, Americans were right there, getting rich. Not working-class Americans, not farmers, not immigrants, elite families. The same ones whose names we see on universities, museums, libraries, and trusts. They didn't just participate, they dominated certain routes. They formed partnerships with British firms, they invested in ships built specifically to smuggle opium. They created companies whose profits shaped American capitalism. These families didn't just sell opium, they built the American establishment with that money. Yale's endowments, Harvard's buildings, Boston's elite clubs, old money fortunes in New York and New England, all of them are tied to narcotics smuggling in China. And these weren't forgotten lines. These were the families who produced U.S. presidents, senators, billionaires, and media empires. They rewrote the history books, replaced opium trafficker with merchant, and turned drug lords into philanthropists. Why doesn't anyone talk about this? Because the winners write history, and these families won. They became respectable. They built railroads, banks, magazines, universities, and political dynasties. They funded churches and charities. They scrubbed their past so clean that even teachers don't know it happened. But the paper trail exists. Shipping logs, business records, family letters. They reveal how America's aristocracy built its foundation on the corpses of millions of Chinese addicts. And once those fortunes were secure, these same families supported laws that criminalized drugs in America, turning narcotics into a weapon of social control for everyone else. First, they profited. Then, they punished. Now let's break down the families, name by name, and show you exactly how deep this goes. Before we go through the families, understand something crucial. These were not small smugglers hiding in docks at night. These were polished gentlemen, respected businessmen, church leaders, and cultural icons. They wore suits, not bandanas. They attended Harvard and Yale, not back-alley dens. They shook hands with presidents, married into other elite bloodlines, and operated companies that still exist today. They didn't handle opium like criminals. They handled it like investment bankers. They formed committees, negotiated supply routes, financed ships, and insured cargo. They tracked profits in ledgers. They built networks across Boston, New York, London, Canton, and Calcutta. They understood international finance before most Americans even knew what a stock market was. They were pioneers in globalization, but their product was addiction. They created the first American millionaires at a time when the United States had no aristocracy, no dukes, no barons, no landed nobility. These opium merchants became the aristocracy. They bought mansions, filled them with European art, and treated themselves like royalty. Their names became synonymous with old money. This is why America feels like it has classes, even though it claims not to. The upper class wasn't built on entrepreneurship and innovation. It was built on opium. And here's the darker punchline. These families didn't just profit from selling drugs overseas. They helped design America's early political and financial systems. They funded campaigns, influenced foreign policy, and shaped the country's view of China. They pushed narratives that blamed the Chinese for addiction, while they themselves were the suppliers. Imagine selling poison to a country, then claiming that country is backward because its people are addicted. That's exactly what happened. The opium merchants began as traders, but they evolved into something much more dangerous: institution builders. They created banks that financed the Industrial Revolution, textile mills powered by Asian labor, railroads that connected the continent, and trusts that controlled global resources. By the time the American public learned what opium was, the families who sold it had already moved into something far more respectable: philanthropy. Museums, hospitals, orphanages, and universities were funded with drug money. They washed their sins with culture. That's why history remembers them not as traffickers, but as patrons of civilization. But to understand how this transformation happened, we need to start with the blueprint. There were four primary hubs of the American opium elite: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and the Connecticut River Valley. Each region produced firms that ran fleets of ships to Canton, partnered with British drug houses, and dominated the trade. From those regions came families whose descendants still show up in politics, banking, media, and the Ivy League. Their influence is not ancient history, it's still with us. Now let's go deeper. Let's look at the first family on this list, the men who turned opium into an empire so large that it shaped American education itself. Let's start with one of the most influential and surprising entries in this entire story, the Russell family. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Yale University students pass it every day without knowing what it means. Buildings, scholarships, and institutions carry the Russell name as a badge of honor. But behind that polished legacy lies a truth almost no one is taught. The Russells were not just merchants. They were opium kings. The family firm Russell and Company became the largest American opium smuggler in China. They didn't dabble in the trade, they dominated it. They controlled shipping routes, negotiated deals with British houses, and built a commercial empire in Canton that rivaled European competitors. Their success didn't happen by accident. It was strategic, brutal, and calculated. The Russells understood something most Americans didn't. China was the future. Whoever controlled the China trade controlled wealth beyond imagination. And since China didn't want foreign goods, the Russells gave them what they didn't ask for: opium. They pushed tons of narcotics into a nation struggling against addiction, and they made fortunes so large that they still echo today. Now here's where it gets even more disturbing. The Russells didn't just build wealth. They used opium profits to build influence. They poured money into American infrastructure, banking, and most importantly, education. They were instrumental in financing Yale during a period when the university was struggling for funds. Without opium money, Yale would look very different today. Then comes the twist you were never told. The Russell family founded Skull and Bones, Yale's most secretive and powerful society. Presidents, CIA directors, cabinet members, Wall Street titans, media moguls, all passed through its tomb-like headquarters. The organization that helped shape American foreign policy, banking, and intelligence began with money earned from drug smuggling. Think about that for a moment. One of the most influential power networks in American history was seeded by narcotics profits extracted from a foreign nation ravaged by addiction. And it didn't end there. Members of Skull and Bones went on to run railroads, banks, and multinational companies. They influenced wars, elections, and even the creation of U.S. intelligence agencies. The Russells didn't just get rich, they rewired America from behind the scenes. Yet when you walk through Yale today, you won't find plaques explaining that an opium empire funded these legacies. You'll see marble, honorific inscriptions, and stories of great men who built a nation. The truth has been sanitized, scrubbed clean like a crime scene before the police arrive. This is how history is rewritten. Not with lies, but with omissions. The Russell name remains celebrated. The devastation wrought in China is forgotten. Millions suffered, millions died, and an elite American dynasty was born. And the Russells were only the beginning, because once the blueprint was laid, other families followed, families whose names are carved into libraries, museums, and foundations we admire without ever questioning their origins. Let's move to the next powerhouse, another dynasty whose fortune was painted gold, but whose roots were soaked in opium. Next on our list is a family whose name defines American wealth, respectability, and philanthropy, yet whose origins are buried under centuries of careful reputation management. The Delano family. If that name rings a bell, it should. Warren Delano II was the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, the man who led America through the Great Depression and World War II. His middle name wasn't chosen at random. It was a tribute to the Delano bloodline, a family whose fortune was not built on innovation or industry, but on narcotics. Warren Delano didn't accidentally stumble into the China trade. He embraced it. He understood exactly what opium would do to China, and he understood exactly what it would do for his bank account. In his own letters, Delano admitted he dealt in what he called, quote, the only article with which a profit can be made. That article was opium. He didn't whisper it. He didn't hide it. He knew it was illegal in China and morally questionable, but he also knew something else. It was insanely profitable. Delano worked for Russell and Company, the same firm run by the Russells, the opium giants we just discussed. He sailed to Canton, negotiated prices, set up distribution networks, and watched as addiction hollowed out a civilization. And with every sale, his fortune grew. The Delano family didn't smuggle opium in secret. They did it with the full knowledge of American elites. The trade was an open secret, and no one cared as long as the profits flowed. It was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. Men like Delano were considered pioneers, adventurers, and captains of commerce. Think about this. The great American presidential dynasty, Roosevelt, didn't rise from heroic sacrifice or patriotic entrepreneurship. It rose from narcotics. Without opium, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would not have been born into privilege. He would not have entered politics, and the trajectory of the 20th century might have been completely different. That's not conspiracy. That's genealogy. The Delano wealth didn't stop with Warren. It compounded. It funded investments. It bought ships, land, and influence. By the time FDR was born, the opium stains had been washed away, publicly, at least. The family name was polished, transformed from drug trafficking royalty into American nobility. Schools teach you about Roosevelt's leadership, but they don't teach you where the money came from. And here's the truly twisted part. FDR, the grandson of an opium trader, later supported drug prohibition policies that criminalized narcotics domestically, policies that disproportionately targeted immigrants and minorities. The same product that built his family's fortune became illegal for everyone else. The ladder he climbed was kicked away. This is a pattern you'll see again and again with these families. They got rich from drugs, then they made sure no one else could do the same. The Delanos weren't just another wealthy clan. They were the bridge between the opium trade and the Oval Office. Their legacy sits in history books, presidential libraries, and national myths. But the foundation of that legacy lies on the other side of the world, in the ruins of Qing Dynasty China. And the Delanos weren't alone. They opened a door others would walk through. Families whose fingerprints are all over American capitalism. The next family didn't just profit from opium, they industrialized it. They scaled it. They took narcotics distribution and turned it into a model for global corporate expansion. You know their name. Now we arrive at a family whose fingerprints are so deep in American commerce that their legacy touches nearly every part of the economy. They didn't just from opium, they built a business around it, one that would become the blueprint for America. Today, the name Forbes is associated with wealth rankings, business magazines, journalism. But before it became a media empire, before the lists of billionaires and power brokers, the Forbes fortune was rooting far drug money. The family patriarchs, reporters, or editors, they were opium merchants. Men like Robert Bennett Forbes and John Murray Forbes made their fortunes narcotics into China. They didn't just participate in the trade, they scaled it. They improved shipping efficiency, optimized smuggling routes, and partnered with Britishes to maximize supply. Their ships were faster, their deals were, and their profits were enormous. Robert Bennett Forbes even wrote memoirs bragging about his exploits in the China trade, casually discussing the of addiction like a man describing Tory. There was no shame, only business, and business was booming. The Forbes treated opium like a commodity, no different from cotton, tea, or spices. They refined logistics, created networks, and expanded operations in ways that would later define capitalism. They were innovators, yes, but innovators in narcotics trafficking. Their success didn't stop with drug money. Once they had amassed a fortune, invested aggressively. Railroads, manufacturing, banking, and eventually media. Their capital corrupted industries and reshaped the United States economy during its formative years. And here's the part most people never connect. The Forbes wealth eventually helped establish the American media class. The same family that once trafficked opium into China now influences how Americans understand wealth, power, business, and success. They moved from pushing drugs to shaping narratives that conveniently avoided their origins. Imagine the irony. A family that helped addict millions now publishes rankings determining who counts as the richest and most influential people in the world. The gatekeepers of legitimacy were once gatekeepers of poison. Forbes' name carries prestige. There are no disclaimers, no historical footnotes. Their philanthropic legacy echoes the suffering they enabled, just like they built them on a narcotic that destroyed a civilization. And this wasn't an accident, it wasn't a phase, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a business model. The Forbes family didn't invent that model, but they perfected it. And once they were done, other families would adopt the same formula, earning fortunes that still echo through boardrooms, campuses, and political offices. Our next family didn't merely... Now we move into a family whose influence is so vast, so interwoven into the architecture of American finance, that their power is felt every time you deposit a check, take out a loan, or read about the stock market. The family connected opium to the White House, and the Forbes family commercialized the trade into a corporate template. The Peabodys transformed drug money into something even more enduring: institutions. George Peabody, called the father of modern philanthropy, is celebrated as a financial pioneer. His name to museums, libraries, schools, and trusts. He's portrayed as a benevolent titan who helped create the foundations of American banking. But here's what the textbooks avoid. George Peabody's fortune was seeded through the opium trade, with the same merchant houses operating in the China narcotics network. He ended in firms tied directly to the smuggling routes that funneled opium into Canton. Once those profits stabilized, Peabody used them to establish financial institutions in London and the United States, institutions that would evolve into what we now recognize as the American banking system. This is where the story shifts from merchants to money managers, because Peabody didn't just accumulate wealth, he weaponized it. His firms mastered international currency exchange, credit extensions, long-term debt financing, and global investment strategies. These tools later became standard practice in modern capitalism. And one of the young men Peabody mentored, funded, and eventually passed his financial empire to was a man named Junius Spencer Morgan. That's because Junius Morgan's son was John Pierpont Morgan, better known as J.P. Morgan. Yes, that Morgan, the architect of Wall Street, the man who bailed out the U.S. Treasury. the titan who built the most powerful banking empire in American history. Of Morgan, the foundation of modern finance, traces its origin not to railroads or industry, but to Peabody's capital structures, which themselves were seeded by profits tied to the China opium trade. Next time someone tells you America was built on free enterprise, innovation, and grit, remember this. The United States financial system, the system that determines interest rates, corporate valuations, and national debt, rests on a foundation poured by men who made their first fortunes selling narcotics to Asia. He is remembered as a philanthropist. Statues honor him. Institutions bear his name. Meanwhile, the millions who suffered addiction, poverty, and death because of the opium economy he helped fuel have no monuments. That's the true genius of America's elite. They turn crimes into capital. They turn capital into institutions. They turn institutions into legacy. And once the legacy is secure, the origin story disappears. Done yet. The next name on this list didn't just profit from opium. They leveraged it to become stewards of American culture, curators of taste, morality, and public opinion. They didn't build banks or magazines. They built the American ideology. Now we arrive at a family whose legacy is carved into the American cultural landscape, not through finance or politics alone, but through taste, refinement, and moral authority. They didn't just accumulate wealth, they shaped what America aspired to be. The Astor family. Most people know the Astors as Gilded Age aristocrats, hotel magnates, real estate barons, patrons of the arts, and the embodiment of old money prestige. Their name evokes images of marble halls, opera boxes, and fortunes vast enough to rival European nobility. But long before the Astors became synonymous with New York high society, their wealth had a very different origin. Opium. John Jacob Astor, the man celebrated as America's first multimillionaire, built a significant part of his fortune by trafficking drugs into China. He invested heavily in the Canton trade, working alongside the same network of American smugglers who turned opium into the most profitable commodity on earth. Astor didn't handle barrels himself. He financed, insured, and expanded operations. He treated narcotics like a business asset, not a moral question. When the trade boomed, Astor prospered. When the legal pressure increased, he exited at the perfect moment, quietly cashing out while others continued the dirty work. That exit strategy is a hallmark of true elite behavior. Get in early, extract maximum profit, leave before the consequences arrive. Astor then took his opium proceeds and did something transformative. He bought America, or at least the parts of it that mattered. He invested in Manhattan real estate, blocks of land that would one day become the heart of New York City. He purchased hotels, theaters, and properties that generated generational wealth. As his holdings multiplied, so did his reputation. Newspapers hailed him as a visionary businessman. Nobody mentioned the narcotics. By the time the Astors entered the Gilded Age, their drug origins had been scrubbed away. They were now tastemakers, guardians of American etiquette, culture, and propriety. Their name appeared in society pages, not customs records. The irony is staggering. A family that once profited from addiction became the arbiters of high society, defining what was respectable, elegant, and refined. Their descendants married into European aristocracies, funded libraries and museums, and shaped elite social circles for over a century. The Astors weren't merely rich, they were cultural engineers. They decided who was welcome at the table and who wasn't. And yet beneath the velvet and gold, beneath the portraits and foundation plaques, lies a truth never taught in schools. The Astor Empire was fertilized with opium. It didn't grow from innovation or genius. It grew from narcotics smuggling, a business that destroyed Chinese communities while elevating American prestige. This pattern should now be unmistakable. The Russells built power through education and secret societies. The Delanos carried drug money into the Oval Office. The Forbes family industrialized addiction. The Peabodys financialized it, and the Astors culturalized it. Each family laundered their legacy into something America applauds. But there's still one more turn in this story, one final transformation that reveals the full scale of the Opium Dynasty machine. Because some families didn't stop at wealth, influence, or ideology. They turned opium into global control. Control over resources, media, and geopolitical strategy. Now we arrive at a family whose legacy is carved into the American cultural. If the Astors crafted America's cultural identity, and the Delanos shaped its political destiny, then this next family forged something far more powerful, the American narrative itself. They didn't just influence wealth, laws, or taste. They influenced reality, what Americans believe, what they remember, and perhaps most importantly, what they forget. This family understood a truth the others merely exploited. Control the story, and you control the future. Enter the Cabot family, the Brahmins of Boston. The Cabots weren't just wealthy. They were definers of legitimacy. They didn't merely join elite society, they set the rules for it. Their motto might as well have been, "There's the Cabots and the Lowells, and the rest of you don't matter." But beneath that polished exterior, beneath the Ivy League endowments, beneath the poetry, theology, philanthropy, and governance, lies the same foundational rot: opium money. The Cabots made their fortune by smuggling narcotics into China, using the same networks as the Perkinses, Russells, and Forbes families. They weren't just participants, they were architects. They helped map routes, finance expeditions, and build infrastructure that turned addiction into enterprise. Their ships left New England ports with missionary Bibles and returned with drug profits. Their sons studied theology at Harvard, while their fathers shipped narcotics across the Pacific. Their public charity masked private devastation. And once the profits flowed, the Cabots did something few families dared. They became the moral authorities of America. They sat on boards of universities. They shaped curricula. They wrote history textbooks. They chaired churches, museums, and cultural societies. They embedded themselves into the moral fabric of the nation. Their opinions weren't contested, they were doctrine. That's the genius of the Cabots. They didn't just launder money, they laundered truth. They made it socially unacceptable to question their origins. They made wealth synonymous with virtue. They positioned themselves as guardians of American correctness while burying the very thing that created their power. It's hard to overstate their reach. Cabots married into other trafficking dynasties, forming alliances that still exist today. Their family tree is a web connecting politics, finance, media, and academia. Their descendants have served as senators, ambassadors, federal judges, university trustees, and corporate executives. And through it all, their role in the opium trade is treated as a historical footnote if it's mentioned at all. But here's the pivot. The Cabots did something even more insidious than the other families. They didn't merely hide the truth, they replaced it. They wrote narratives that framed the United States as a moral force, a civilizing agent, a righteous power. They helped popularize the idea of America's divine mission, while knowing full well that the nation's elite were built on narcotic wealth extracted from a broken China.
They transformed guilt into mythology, and that mythology became education. Once you understand this, American history reads differently. You start seeing omissions not as accidents, but as strategy. You realize that silence isn't absence, it's engineering. The Cabots weren't just wealthy, they were the curators of memory. And as long as they controlled the narrative, no one would ever ask how a nation with no hereditary aristocracy somehow ended up with families who behaved exactly like one. So now we have the picture. The Delanos supplied political power. The Russells engineered institutional dominance. The Forbes family built commercial empire. The Peabodys structured global finance. The Astors crafted cultural prestige. The Cabots rewrote history to hide the crime. And yet there is still one final layer to this story. One last family whose reach transcended trade, wealth, and narrative. A family whose opium profits didn't just shape America, they shaped the world order that emerged after the Age of Empires. They didn't merely benefit from opium, they weaponized it. They turned addiction into strategy, economics into empire, and history into propaganda. They didn't just participate in the system, they became the system. Their fingerprints are on global governance, intelligence agencies, private banks, and corporate power. They are the bridge between the old world of opium smugglers and the modern world of multinational influence. And once you see who they are, everything else makes sense. However, not everyone accepted Julian's reforms without resistance. The Senate in Rome, still dominated by Christian converts and bishops wielding immense influence, viewed his policies as a direct threat to their growing power. Tensions ran high, and whispers of conspiracy began to circulate in the marble halls of Roman authority. Julian, however, was undeterred. He believed deeply that the empire had strayed from its traditional roots and that Christianity, though spreading rapidly, was weakening Roman unity from within. In letters and speeches, he spoke passionately about restoring the old values that had once defined Rome: discipline, honor, courage, and the strength of the gods who guided their ancestors. But Julian's ambition stretched far beyond religious transformations. He wanted to reclaim territories Rome had lost, dreaming of restoring the empire to its former glory. His gaze turned eastward to Persia, the long-standing rival that had humiliated Roman legions in the past. Determined to reverse these defeats, he prepared for a massive military campaign, one that he hoped would immortalize his name alongside the greatest emperors of history. As he marched with his legions, Julian was met with admiration. Soldiers respected his refusal to indulge in luxury, his willingness to eat their rations, sleep in the open air, and fight alongside them. Unlike many emperors before him, he had earned loyalty not through fear, but through example. Yet destiny had other plans. In the heat of the Persian campaign, Julian was struck by a spear, its origin still debated by historians. Some insist it came from an enemy soldier, while others believe a Christian officer delivered the fatal blow. Regardless of the truth, the result was the same. Julian, the last pagan emperor of Rome, fell. With his death, Rome's ancient religion collapsed with sudden finality. His successors abandoned his reforms almost immediately, reinstating Christianity as the dominant force. Temples once again fell silent, their fires extinguished forever. Julian's vision of a Rome reborn in the image of its old gods vanished like smoke on the battlefield winds of Persia. Yet history remembers him, not merely as a ruler, but as the final spark of an ancient world struggling against the rising tide of a new faith. His reign was brief, but his defiance left an imprint that historians still debate centuries later. His life poses a timeless question. Can a single leader reverse the tide of history, or are they merely swept along by forces greater than themselves?
Julian's death marked a turning point, not just for Rome, but for the entire Western world. With the last pagan emperor gone, Christianity surged forward without opposition, reshaping culture, politics, and identity itself. The old gods were no longer worshipped, their statues abandoned to crumble beneath gathering dust. Rituals that had once united the empire were forgotten, replaced by new doctrines, new traditions, and a new world view that would define the next 1,000 years. What makes Julian's story so compelling is not merely his resistance, but the timing of his struggle. He stood at the crossroads of two civilizations, one ancient and steeped in myth, the other rising on the foundations of a new faith. Julian believed Rome's power rested upon the gods who had guided its legions and shaped its destiny. To him, abandoning them meant abandoning the empire's soul. Yet the momentum of history was not in his favor. Christianity was more than a religion, it was a movement, spreading through every rank of society. It filled the vacuum left by old beliefs, offered purpose to the powerless, and created a unified identity that Rome's fractured traditions could no longer provide. The empire no longer served gods made in its own image. Instead, it embraced a God who transcended its borders. Julian had tried to stem this tide, but the world had already begun to change. His failure was not due to lack of conviction or courage, but because his vision belonged to a past that could no longer sustain itself. Even his enemies begrudgingly admired his intellect, discipline, and sincerity. They called him apostate, not for his unbelief, but for daring to believe in something the empire had already forgotten. In the end, Julian became a symbol, a reminder of the moment when the ancient world took its final breath. His reign was short, but it represented the last flicker of a tradition stretching back thousands of years. When that flame went out, an age ended and another began. Rome would live on, but no longer as the Rome Julian thought to restore. Its cities, laws, and armies endured, but its spirit transformed. The temples fell silent, but the churches echoed with chants. The empire that once bent the world beneath its banners now knelt before a cross. Julian's life asks us to consider something profound. What happens when a civilization forgets its origins? Can a nation survive if it abandons the beliefs that built it? And is history shaped by ideas or by those bold enough to defend them? But Julian's legacy did not end with his death. In the centuries that followed, scholars, philosophers, and historians continued to debate his place in history. Some saw him as a tragic hero, a visionary caught between eras. Others viewed him as a fool, unable to recognize the unstoppable rise of Christianity. Yet regardless of these interpretations, one fact remains undeniable. Julian was the last Roman emperor who dared to challenge the direction of an age. His writings survived long after his temples crumbled. In them, he criticized the corruption he perceived in Christian leadership and argued that Rome's abandonment of its ancestral gods would lead to moral decline. Whether he was right or wrong is still argued today, but his words reveal a mind deeply concerned with the fate of civilization. His reforms, though short-lived, were not without purpose. He attempted to create a pagan counterpart to Christian institutions, establishing charities and schools, hoping to revive the civic values he believed had once made Rome great.
He understood that religion was not merely personal belief, it was the foundation of society, shaping laws, culture, and identity. Yet Julian underestimated the power of the movement he opposed. Christianity was not simply replacing old gods, it was redefining the meaning of empire, authority, and faith itself. While paganism relied on tradition and ancestry, Christianity offered salvation, purpose, and universal belonging. Where Rome had once united people through conquest, Christianity united them through belief. This was the world Julian stepped into, a world already moving in a direction he could not reverse, no matter how passionately he fought. His struggle was not against armies, but against time itself. He tried to pull history backward, only to realize that history does not yield to willpower, no matter how strong. Still, his story remains a powerful reminder that even emperors can become outsiders in their own era. He was crowned ruler of an empire that had already outgrown the world he cherished. To his supporters, he was a guardian of ancient wisdom. To his critics, he was a relic. To history, he became something rarer, a symbol of civilization caught in the moment of transformation. Julian's reign stands as the final chapter of an age defined by myth, ritual, and the gods of Olympus. After him, the Roman world stepped fully into a new epoch, one dominated not by Jupiter, Mars, or Apollo, but by a single transformative deity, whose influence would reach far beyond Rome's borders and shape the future of Europe itself. The old world had closed its eyes. The new world had opened them. As centuries passed, Julian's reign became a historical fault line, one of those rare turning points where the past and future collide. His life marked the final moment when Rome might have chosen a different path. Had he succeeded, the Western world could have evolved into a civilization where the old gods and ancient philosophies continued to shape culture and power. Instead, Rome embraced a faith that would eventually reshape continents, inspire empires, and leave an imprint on nearly every corner of the modern world. Historians often ask, was Julian fighting for Rome or for his own vision of what Rome once had been? His critics argue he was blinded by nostalgia, unable to see that the empire he loved no longer existed. The Rome of his youth was already fractured, not by Christian influence, but by internal decay, political corruption, and centuries of relentless warfare. To them, Julian was a man building temples on foundations that were already crumbling. But his supporters see something different. They see a ruler who recognized that identity is more than territory or wealth, that a nation is held together not by force, but by shared beliefs. Julian understood something that many leaders still overlook. Civilizations are not destroyed from without, but from within, when they forget who they are. His failure revealed an uncomfortable truth. Once a society abandons the values that built it, rebuilding becomes nearly impossible. Rome did not collapse because Julian lost his struggle. Rome collapsed because the empire no longer believed in itself. Christianity filled a void that pagan Rome had allowed to grow. In doing so, it ensured its own triumph. Over time, Julian became a symbol not of paganism, but of resistance to cultural transformation. His story forces us to confront an unsettling question, one that echoes long after his death. Can a civilization survive dramatic change without losing its essence, or must something always be sacrificed? For Rome, the answer was clear. With Julian's passing, the ancient world did not merely fade, it was buried. The temples closed, the fires of Olympus dimmed, The empire's divine patrons, once invoked before every battle and every law, became stories told in hushed voices, then eventually forgotten. Yet Julian's memory endured. The Christian Church viewed him with suspicion, labeling him an enemy of the faith. Pagans revered him as their last champion. Even today, he stands as a reminder of a world that came within a breath of choosing a different future. And in that razor-thin moment, between gods and God, between past and destiny, the fate of Western civilization was sealed.
But history is rarely so absolute. Even as Christianity became the defining force of Europe, echoes of the old world persisted. Pagan symbols, rituals, and philosophies did not vanish completely. They were absorbed, repurposed, or transformed. Festivals once dedicated to the gods of Rome took on new Christian meanings. Temples were converted into churches. Philosophical ideas rooted in Greek and Roman thought continued to shape theology, government, and education. The empire changed its gods, but it could not escape its past. Julian's struggle highlighted this paradox. He believed the empire could reclaim its identity by restoring the old ways, yet the Romans themselves had already begun merging ancient customs with new beliefs. Christianity did not conquer paganism by erasing it. It conquered by adapting, adopting, and redefining it. In the end, Julian was not fighting a takeover. He was fighting an evolution. This is what makes his story resonate far beyond its time. Julian forces us to recognize that civilizations do not shift overnight. They transform like rivers, slowly altering course until one day they find themselves flowing in an entirely new direction. By the time Julian became emperor, the river of Roman culture had already changed. He tried to drag it backward, but no one, not even an emperor, can reverse the current of history. Yet the question remains, was Julian wrong? If Rome had held on to its ancestral gods, would it have endured longer? Would the empire have avoided the fragmentation, invasions, and dark centuries that followed? Some argue that Rome's decline was inevitable, that no religion could have saved it from political corruption, economic turmoil, and barbarian pressure. Others insist that once Rome surrendered its ancient values, it lost the very spirit that had carried it to greatness. Whatever the truth, Julian's reign stands as a testament to the power of belief. His story reminds us that ideas, not armies, shape the fate of nations. A single doctrine, embraced by millions, can outlast empires. A single emperor, even one wielding absolute authority, cannot halt a transformation already written in the hearts of people. Rome survived Julian, but it was no longer Julian's Rome. The world he tried to save became unrecognizable within a generation. The Pantheon was silent, the cross was raised, and the ancient empire, once the mightiest in history, was now a vessel for a faith that would outlast its own borders and endure long after its ruins crumbled. Julian's defeat was not just the failure of a ruler, it was the end of an age. And yet, for all that was lost, Julian's legacy endures because he represents something timeless, the struggle between tradition and change. Every civilization reaches a moment when it must decide whether to cling to the past or embrace the future. Julian stood at that crossroads, armed not with superstition, but with conviction, firm in his belief that the ancient gods who forged Rome's destiny still had a role to play. To some, he was a romantic trapped in a pragmatic age. To others, he was the last defender of a world that deserved to survive. His vision may have failed, but the questions he raised continue to haunt historians, leaders, and thinkers alike. How much of the past must be preserved for a society to retain its identity?
At what point does adaptation become surrender? And can a culture truly evolve without erasing what made it unique? Julian's reign provides no easy answers. It shows us that belief is not merely a matter of faith, it is a foundation upon which empires stand. Once that foundation shifts, everything built upon it must shift as well. Rome changed its gods, and in doing so, it changed itself. Whether this transformation was an act of renewal or an omen of collapse depends entirely on how one views the centuries that followed. But perhaps Julian's greatest impact lies not in what he stopped, but in what he could not stop. His failure illustrates a truth as old as history. The world does not wait for those who hesitate. It moves forward, often leaving behind even the most powerful figures. Julian imagined himself the restorer of Rome's forgotten greatness. Instead, he became a symbol of how swiftly greatness can be redefined. The irony is unmistakable. The emperor who sought to revive the gods of Olympus instead ensured that their twilight would be remembered forever. By resisting the new faith, he highlighted its unstoppable momentum. By defending the old world, he revealed how fragile it had become. Julian's life did not mark the survival of Rome's ancient traditions, it marked their memorial. He stands today not as a conqueror, but as the last witness to a chapter of human history that closed with him. After Julian, Rome's identity was rewritten. Its purpose changed, its destiny shifted, and the civilization that once worshipped countless gods now served one. Julian may have been Rome's final pagan emperor, but he was also its final reminder that even the greatest powers are not immune to time, belief, and transformation. In the centuries that followed, Julian's name took on a life far beyond the details of his reign. To Christian writers, he became a cautionary tale, a ruler who dared to defy divine destiny and paid the price. They called him Julian the Apostate, stripping him of his imperial majesty and reducing him to an example of heresy defeated by truth. Their stories painted him as arrogant, misguided, and doomed from the moment he challenged the growing faith of the empire. But outside the walls of Christian authority, a different Julian emerged. Pagan intellectuals saw him as a martyr of cultural memory, the last protector of a fading world. Renaissance humanists, fascinated by antiquity, admired his intellect and philosophical depth. Enlightenment thinkers praised his critique of religious power. Even in modern times, his legacy draws scholars who debate not just what he believed, but what he represented. The final struggle between myth and monotheism, legend and doctrine, multiplicity and unity. Julian's story endures because it refuses to fit neatly into the narratives history prefers. He was neither villain nor saint, neither savior nor tyrant. He was a ruler caught in a tempest of ideas, standing alone against forces that were not merely political, but spiritual and cultural. In that sense, Julian was not fighting Christians. He was fighting the inevitability of transformation. Perhaps that is why his reign continues to fascinate us. Rome did not fall the moment Julian died, yet something profound ended with him. The possibility of a Rome defined by its ancient gods, rituals, and myths vanished forever. After Julian, the empire could no longer return to what it once was. A threshold had been crossed, and history marched forward without looking back. This moment, this irreversible shift, is what gives Julian's life such haunting power. His story is not about a lost religion, it is about a lost direction. He reminds us that civilizations are not destroyed suddenly, they are redirected, one belief, one leader, one generation at a time. The world does not collapse when its walls crumble, but when its spirit changes. Rome did not lose to invaders, it surrendered to an idea. And Julian? He was the last emperor who tried to stop that surrender. He stood against a tide no army could repel, armed only with conviction. He did not fail because he was weak. He failed because he was alone. History rarely honors the last of anything. It celebrates beginnings, innovations, and victories. Julian, however, represents something else entirely. The final heartbeat of a world that believed in gods who walked among men, in myths that shaped nations, and in traditions forged before time had rulers. He was not merely the last pagan emperor. He was the last Roman emperor who believed Rome could still choose its destiny. And so the memory of Julian lingers, not as a king who shaped the world, but as one who tried to stop it from changing. His story raises a truth that echoes across eras. No civilization remains what it once was. Time reshapes nations, beliefs, and identities, regardless of the will of those who lead them. Julian thought he could anchor Rome to its past. Instead, he became the marker that divides what Rome had been from what it would become. In hindsight, his reign feels less like a chapter and more like an epilogue, an attempt to preserve something already slipping beyond reach. The empire he inherited was not the Rome of ancient legions, triumphant generals, and divine favor. It was a Rome searching for purpose, fractured by competing beliefs and eroding loyalties. Christianity did not rise because Rome was strong. It rose because Rome was uncertain, vulnerable, and eager for something that promised answers the old gods no longer could. Julian's tragedy lies in his clarity. He saw the transformation happening long before others realized its magnitude. He understood that Rome was redefining itself, and he knew what would be lost. But knowing is not enough. He could not persuade a population that had already shifted its faith, its hopes, and its identity into something new. He tried to resurrect gods who no longer spoke to the hearts of his people. This is why Julian fascinates modern audiences. His struggle reflects a conflict that repeats across civilizations, the battle between legacy and reinvention, memory and progress. Empires fall not when foreign armies breach their walls, but when they forget what those walls were built to protect. Julian may have been unable to save the Rome he revered, but he understood what many leaders failed to grasp, that the beliefs of a society are its lifeblood. Change them, and everything else will follow. Rome survived for centuries after Julian, but it was no longer the Rome he recognized. The empire evolved, split, and eventually faded. Yet the faith it adopted endured. It spread beyond borders, across kingdoms, into the very foundations of Western civilization. Julian tried to stop a tide, only to prove how unstoppable it was. In that sense, his legacy is ironic. He wished to prevent a new world, yet his efforts ensured that we would never forget the moment the old one disappeared. His defeat immortalized the gods he loved, not as living powers, but as history's final whisper of an age long gone. Let's be clear about the scale. Conservative estimates suggest that American firms made $50 to $100 million from the China opium trade between 1800 and 1860. That is $50 to $100 million in 1800s money. Adjusted for inflation, that equals $1.5 to $3 billion in today's dollars. And that was only the profits. The total value of the opium moved was many times higher. This was not small-scale smuggling. This was industrial-scale drug trafficking. Ships, warehouses, agents, bribes, and an entire logistical network. The American firms involved employed thousands of people, Chinese middlemen, ship crews, Canton-based factors, and Boston-based investors. It was a massive, organized commercial enterprise. Except it was not considered criminal in America. It was business, and the men who ran it were celebrated as merchants, philanthropists, and captains of industry. Here is the modern equivalent to understand the magnitude. Imagine if a group of American billionaires today were caught running a cartel that flooded Mexico with fentanyl. Millions of Mexicans addicted, hundreds of thousands dead, and these billionaires used the profits to endow Harvard, fund political campaigns, and build museums. Then, 150 years later, their descendants are presidents, senators, and university chancellors, and no one ever mentions where the original money came from. That is what happened with the Opium families, except we are the descendants living inside the world they built, and we are not supposed to ask questions. The Chinese, remember? In China, the Opium Wars are a foundational part of national identity. They call it the Century of Humiliation, the period when Western powers forced opium into China and carved the country apart. It is taught in every school. Every Chinese citizen knows that Britain and America poisoned their country for profit, and they know it led to colonization, war, and millions of deaths. But in America, we do not teach it. Most Americans could not tell you what the Opium Wars were about. They certainly do not know that American families got rich from them. And they absolutely do not know that those families still control enormous wealth and influence today. The contrast is staggering. China remembers and teaches what was done to them. America forgets, erases, and whitewashes what we did. And the families who profited are happy to keep it that way.